Halloween didn't start with candy and costumes. It began with human sacrifice, burning effigies, and a Celtic belief that on this night, the boundary between our world and the realm of the dead disappears. Let me show you what really happened. The air grows colder. The day becomes shorter. Flowers and grasses wilt. Trees change color and then shed their leaves. In October, the sun god, known to different peoples by various names, descends into the darkness and hands over the reins of power to the lords of winter. Darkness and cold come to possess the world. And as a final gift, the goddess of the earth and the god of fertility bestow a harvest upon the people to survive the dark half of the year, to sail to the other side of the gloom. When winter ends, light and life return, and the hills turn green again. On the wheel of the year, 4 dates mark the turning points of the sun in the sky, and 4 lie between them, signifying the change of seasons. On October 31st, roughly halfway between the autumn equinox and the winter solstice, between Mabon and Yule, the ancient Celts celebrated the end of the harvest and the beginning of winter. Samhain. Samhain. The night when the veil separating the world of men from the world of spirits thins, and the dead come to earth to trouble the living. According to their own legendary history, set down in the epic Lebor Gabala Eren, the Book of Invasions, the Gaels descend from a Scythian prince named Goidel Glas. He created the Gaelic language, and his mother was an Egyptian princess. The Gaels wandered the world for hundreds of years, moving from Egypt to Crete and from the Caspian Sea to Iberia, after which they sailed to the northern islands, where they entered into battle with the local gods. The Tuatha De Danann, a tribe of supernatural beings skilled in magic, were defeated and retreated to the underworld, and the Gaels took Ireland for themselves. In reality, of course, things were not so romantic. There is some disagreement as to when a group of Celtic tribes first arrived in Ireland, but by the Iron Age, they were most likely already there. The Gaels were part of a general wave of Celtic migrations that occurred across Europe roughly in the 2nd millennium BCE. The Celts most likely moved from the continent across the strait into Britain, and then reached Ireland, where they became the Gaels and preserved their unique language and culture.
In essence, the Gaels are a variant of the Celts who settled in the British Isles, primarily in the territories of modern Ireland, Scotland, and some other small enclaves. The Gaels appear in historical records during the Classical Age, when the Roman Empire conquered most of Britain, but not Ireland. Along with the Picts, the ancient indigenous peoples of the Scottish Highlands, the Gaels raided Roman Britain, maintaining their independence. Since then, in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and the Isle of Man, people have spoken the ancient Gaelic languages and preserved the old pagan legends and rites. Their ancestors envisioned the world as a fundamental dichotomy between light and darkness, good and evil gods whose power alternated. Their year began at the end of the autumn harvest, continued through the darkness of winter and the blossoming of spring, through the abundance of summer, and concluded with a new harvest. 2 major festivals divided the year into dark and light halves: Beltane, which fell on May 1st by our calendar, and Samhain, which took place on October 31st. Because the Gaelic day began and ended not at midnight, as ours does, but at sunset, the celebration started on the evening of October 31st and lasted until the morning of November 1st. Medieval texts state that Samhain lasted for a week. Samhain itself, 3 days before and 3 days after. So, if you thought I was bringing up this topic too early, not at all. You can start celebrating right from Wednesday. Cattle were driven from their summer pastures and slaughtered. A lavish feast was prepared. Purifying bonfires were lit. Sacrifices and protective rituals were performed. Masked and costumed people went from house to house, singing songs and receiving treats in exchange. In every home, the arrival of guests from the other world was awaited, both anticipated and feared. These ancient customs survive today in the form of the merry antics of Halloween, a children's holiday that has become international. Most of those who dress up on this night in scary or funny or slightly risque costumes and exchange candy and practical jokes have no idea where it all came from. Settle in comfortably and dim the lights, and check that the doors are well locked. Even in the Stone Age, the ancient inhabitants of Ireland positioned their burial mounds so that twice a year, on Samhain and Beltane, the rising sun shone directly through the low opening leading into the burial chambers. Legends, recorded in the Middle Ages by frightened Christian monks, who, with varying success, attempted to convert the Gaelic pagans to the one god, state that on Samhain, the ancient burial mounds would gape open, revealing portals to the other world. The Aosi, the people of the mounds, fairies, elves, and spirits, could cross into our world. They could be stunningly beautiful, but they could also be terrifying and malevolent. The Buka, a small shape-shifting demon, would offer people a ride on its back, only to then refuse to let go and subject the rider to a wild and terrifying journey across the land. The Lady Chlyn, a terrifying woman dressed in white and accompanied by a black pig, would pursue night travelers, driving them mad. Dullahan, headless riders on fire-eyed black horses carrying their own grotesque heads that grinned with a demonic smirk, chased people and kidnapped them to the underworld. From there, the Headless Horseman would migrate into Washington Irving's story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and through it, ride all the way to Texas, where the legend was immortalized once more by Mayne Reid in his iconic novel, The Headless Horseman. All these demons and fairies were, in all likelihood, atavistic descendants of prehistoric gods of nature and the elements. By historical times, they had significantly lost their power and strength, but they were still to be feared. All year round, the Irish tried to appease their neighbors with offerings of food and drink, but on Samhain, this had to be treated with particular seriousness. Fairy tales recounted how terrifying monsters emerged from the mounds on Samhain, and heroes would slay them with a specially enchanted magic spear for which they became the legendary leaders of their people. Other legends say that sacrifices were performed on Samhain to placate those beneath the burial mounds. The Book of Invasion states that in ancient times, every Samhain, the people of Ireland had to give 2/3 of their children, their grain, and their milk to the monstrous Fomorians, personifications of chaos, darkness, death, and drought. According to the later Annals of the Four Masters, which were written by Christian monks, on Samhain in pagan Ireland, firstborn children were sacrificed to the stone idol Crom Cruach until St. Patrick put an end to all those abominations.
Some scholars suggest that these legends refer to genuinely existing ancient human sacrifices and argue that several Irish bog bodies, naturally mummified corpses of the ancient dead preserved in peat bogs, support this. Indeed, some of them, such as the 2,000-year-old and remarkably well-preserved Crogan man, were apparently important figures, perhaps even kings, who were ritually killed on Samhain. At the very least, this would explain the unusual circumstances of their deaths. Croganhair, where the Crogan man was found, is known in Irish mythology as Brí Eile. In the boyhood deeds of the legendary hero Fionn, we are told, at that time there lived in the enchanted mound of Brí Eile a very beautiful girl, and the name of that girl was Eile. I do not think this is a coincidence. The men of Ireland contended for this girl, and one after another they came to woo her. Every year the wooing took place on Samhain, for the enchanted mounds of Ireland were ever open about Samhain, because nothing could be concealed in the enchanted mounds on Samhain. This is what happened to every man who came to woo her. One of his people was killed. This was done to mark the event, and no one ever learned who did it. A less than pleasant journey. Samhain was also the time of reckoning for those who had violated their geasa that year, the prohibitions or taboos people placed on themselves when making covenants with the gods. A geas is a kind of blessing/curse. Everything will be well with you until you commit some forbidden act. You might prick yourself on a spindle or accept a ripe apple from a strange old woman in the woods. In Irish folklore, it is typically women who impose a geas on men, goddesses, witches, and simply interested ladies skilled in sorcery. For instance, Cuchulainn was under a geas never to eat dog meat. But since all Irish people had a general taboo against refusing a proffered meal, when a witch offers him dog meat, Cuchulainn cannot refuse her, violates his geas, and this leads to his death. And on Samhain, people paid the price for their broken geasa, because it was the end of the year, the end of a temporal cycle. It was also believed that through the portals in the hills, that night, the souls of deceased relatives returned to their homes, to the warm light of the fires in the cold night. And for them, a place was set at the communal table, and windows and doors were left unlocked. The etymology of the word Samhain is still not precisely determined, but it is quite possible that this very ancient name is connected to a Proto-Celtic word, whose original meaning was assembly, and it may have meant the assembly of the living and the dead. Samhain is the night when the entire family gathers at one table, including the ancestors. The family would gather for a silent supper, during which not a word was spoken, as the dead could hear absolutely everything the living said on this night. The souls of grateful relatives might return to bestow blessings, but just as easily, the soul of an aggrieved person could return for revenge. And no one could know exactly what invisible being was sharing the meal with them. Therefore, to be safe, they were invited in, but not spoken to unnecessarily. The portion untouched by the spirits was respectfully left outside the threshold. And apparently, some enterprising and unafraid villagers began to snatch the treats left for the spirits from the doorsteps, and so not to be clobbered, they dressed in costumes of ghosts, werewolves, and other supernatural creatures. At least, that is one version of the origin of the custom of dressing up in wild and terrifying costumes on Samhain. But it is also possible that people began to dress their children up so that the fairies emerging from the mounds wouldn't kidnap them, and malevolent ancestral spirits wouldn't harm them. Irish fairies, in general, were infamous for kidnapping human children and leaving their own changelings in their place, children with red hair
and unnaturally sharp wits. In fact, the belief that a person could be kidnapped by fairies and replaced by an imposter was so strong in the Irish consciousness that in 1895, a woman named Bridget Cleary was murdered by her husband and relatives. They argued that their behavior was justified because she was not the real Bridget, but that the genuine one had been taken by the fairies. They were driven to this belief by the fact that Bridget was an unusually independent woman for an Irish woman of that time, having bought a Singer sewing machine and attempting to establish her own business as a milliner and seamstress. It turns out that in late 19th century Northern Ireland, this was sufficient reason to declare you a creature of the dark arts. It is no wonder that in the Middle Ages, those who had to travel on Samhain night would turn their clothes inside out and smear their faces with soot so that the elves and ancestral spirits emerging from the mounds could not recognize them. And it seems that at some point, cheeky people began to dress up as various forms of malevolent spirits and go from house to house, pretending to be the spirits from underground and demanding food. I do not know how seriously their fellow villagers took them, but gradually this custom of dressing up in costumes, either to impersonate malevolent spirits or to scare them away, and then going from house to house, singing songs and asking for food, spread widely throughout Scotland and Ireland. Interestingly, in other parts of Europe, costumes, caroling, and going around neighbors for treats were part of other annual festivals, closer to Christmas, to Yule. However, in the Gaelic regions, all this was considered more appropriate on the night when supernatural creatures wandered the human world, Samhain. And because everyone expected revenge and petty mischief from the visiting ghosts on this night, the youth took advantage of the impunity to play pranks and tricks, which led to Samhain also being nicknamed the Night of Mischief. Masked young people went from door to door, loudly threatening to cause trouble if they were not welcomed and fed, and to keep their neighbors from recognizing them, their faces were blackened with the ash of the protective bonfires. On Samhain, the druids lit a sacred bonfire on the hilltops and offered sacrifices to the gods. The bonfires were a form of sympathetic magic. By imitating the sun, they aided the forces of life and growth and held back the advance of darkness and winter. These were need fires, lit by friction, using a gigantic fire drill made from an entire oak trunk. It was stood vertically, and a team would spin it using ropes until the tinder beneath the end of the log began to smolder. The flame, smoke, and ash of such a fire were believed to protect and purify. Cattle were driven around the bonfire or across its coals once it had died down a bit. Young people jumped over the fire and marked each other's faces with its ashes. The ash was scattered across the fields to protect the future harvest from disease and frost. And all other fires in homes were extinguished and then relit from the sacred bonfire, with the new flame first being carried sunwise around the house to protect it from evil forces. And since iron lanterns were expensive and rare, they were replaced by the plentiful large turnips and rutabagas. The root vegetables were hollowed out and turned into a lantern, which could be used to carry the sacred fire home. And the costumed revelers illuminated their path with turnip lanterns, on which scary faces were carved for added effect. In the darkness, these lanterns floated above the ground and resembled the will-o-wisps, which were called jack-o'-lantern. The story of jack-o'-lantern exists in many variations. One story says that Jack the trickster tricked Satan into climbing an apple tree, and as soon as he climbed up, Jack quickly carved crosses into the trunk, after which Satan could not descend and was trapped. Jack only released Satan after the latter agreed never to take his soul. But this did not make Jack immortal. And when Jack died, he could not enter heaven as he was a notorious sinner. However, Satan had promised not to take his soul, so he could not enter hell either. As a result, Jack had nowhere to go. He carved a lantern out of a turnip, put a piece of coal from the fires of hell into it, and set off to roam the earth in search of refuge. And when you see a wandering light over a bog, it is Jack's soul wandering the earth, finding no rest. In the late 19th century, with the wave of mass Irish emigration, the traditions and beliefs of Samhain would cross the ocean to America to spread there in the form of the modern holiday of Halloween. Instead of turnips, lanterns would begin to be carved from the much more suitable and larger local pumpkin, and dressing up, begging neighbors for candy, and pranks under the cover of darkness would become almost exclusively a children's entertainment. From communicating with ancestral spirits and the underworld inhabitants, and from divination and fortune-telling, there remained noisy games, such as apple bobbing, where players tried to grab apples floating in a large tub with their teeth without using their hands. In the old world, a name was written on each apple, and young women and men would try to retrieve a desirable future spouse with their teeth. Apples in ancient times were, on average, much smaller than they are today. So if you decide to revive this glorious tradition of pulling apples out of a tub with your teeth, first, choose smaller apples to avoid dislocating your jaw, and second, rewatch Hercule Poirot's Halloween. That's Season 12, Episode 3. How exactly did Samhain turn into Halloween? The Christianization of ancient pagan cults began in the early Middle Ages. The importance of pre-Christian customs in the lives of people apparently did not escape the attention of the early Catholic Church. Pope Gregory, also known as Saint Gregory the Great, who led the church from 590 to 604, advised a missionary heading to England that instead of trying to put an end to the religious customs of non-Christian peoples, he should simply try to fill them with Christian content. In the 9th century, the Catholic Church designated November 1st as All Saints' Day, and November 2nd became All Souls' Day. This created a 3-day observance known as All Hallowtide, or the period of All Saints. It began with a vigil on the eve of All Saints' Day, October 31st, continued through All Saints' Day, November 1st, and concluded with All Souls' Day, November 2nd. This word gradually morphed into the modern Halloween. The custom of inviting the souls of ancestors into the home was naturally replaced by Christian prayers for the departed, and the tradition of baking and distributing soul cakes to the poor merged with treating the costumed revelers who came to the door. The bonfires, once used to ward off fairies, began to ward off the devil. In the Middle Ages, churches in Europe that were too poor to display the relics of martyr saints on All Saints' Day allowed parishioners to dress up as saints instead. Many believed that once a year, the dead rise from the cemeteries for one wild, disgusting carnival known as the Danse Macabre. The Danse Macabre called upon Christians to remember the end of all earthly things, the finiteness of life, and the futility of worldly pleasures, that we will all end up there. And on Halloween, it was acted out in village performances. People dressed up as corpses, wrapped themselves in shrouds, and painted themselves as skeletons, which, again, organically merged with the customs of Samhain. The modern Christian church has an ambiguous attitude towards Halloween. Some consider it a harmless children's holiday, while others go so far as to brand Halloween as a pagan event verging on devil worship. That is to say, there is no single unified attitude of the entire Christian church towards Halloween, and the position of the local church largely depends on your local priest. Since there are many types of neo-paganism, their Samhain celebrations can differ greatly. Reconstructionists attempt to emulate the historical festival as closely as possible, minus perhaps the human sacrifices, I certainly hope. Other neo-pagans approach the celebrations creatively, basing them on several different unrelated traditions, and the Gallic tradition is only one of them. Furthermore, in the Southern Hemisphere, neo-pagans celebrate Samhain not on October 31st, but from April 30th to May 1st, because that is when their harvest ends and the dark time of the year begins. Some astronomically minded neo-pagans insist that Samhain should be celebrated exactly at the astronomical midpoint between the autumn equinox and the winter solstice, which falls not on October 31st, but somewhere around the 6th or 7th of November in the Northern Hemisphere. It should be noted that the Wheel of the Year is a modern concept and by no means an ancient one. It is not the case that all ancient Celts celebrated all 8 holidays in the year. At best 4, and for the most part, only 2. The words Litha, Astara, and Mabon only emerged in the 1970s, when modern witches were settling the annual schedule of Sabbats. So the next time you get involved in an online argument about the precise astronomical day on which a particular pagan holiday should be celebrated this year, remember that the overwhelming majority of anyone's ancestors, frankly, did not have the time to hold festivals every 6 weeks. The customs of Samhain and Halloween, in a veiled way, recount the terrible truth of life in antiquity, when people were catastrophically helpless against the forces of nature and physical survival remained a daily problem. And in order to survive, to make it through the winter, to avoid perishing from hunger and cold, from disease and wild beasts, people appealed to supernatural forces and tried, through bribery, supplication, and deception, to beg from them a little more life, which was waning along with the receding sun.